Welcome back to our last talk of the day. Another person joining us all the way from Germany, Markus. Markus works as Markus works as the team lead and staff engineer at Microbialytics. He became a Django core contributor in early 2015 and served as a member of the Django technical board for the 3.x release series. Markus is a member of the Django security and operations team, as well as organizer of DjangoCon conferences.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. And well, it's still early, so I figured I'll do a bit of a pre-recording so you can enjoy my past self now. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to my talk on authentication and identification processes. Some of you may know me from my engagement in the Django project. Historically, I've primarily contributed to Django's migration system. Over time, my focus shifted to organizing some DjangoCons in Europe and Australia, as well as being a member of its operations and security teams. In my day job, I'm a staff engineer and team lead at Microbialytics and responsible for our cloud infrastructure and software. At Microbialytics, we build hardware and software to analyze chemical liquids and try to revolutionize and modernize the industry in the context of Industry 4.0. We are also hiring within Europe for Python Django, C#.NET, and TypeScript Angular, as well as numerous other positions. When we talk about identification and authentication systems in the world of computers and our society, we also have to look at what was there in the centuries and millennia before. For thousands of years, people needed to identify themselves towards others, be it to show they are from the same or a befriended tribe, be it that they had a certain status within a tribe, or be it that they hold a certain profession. As you can imagine, over the years, humans came up with all kinds of ways to accomplish that. It all started about 100,000 years ago in South Africa, Algeria, and Israel. People used beads and shells as jewelry. Eshkul, or the Skull Cave, is a prehistoric cave site about 20 kilometers south of the city of Haifa, Israel, and about 3 kilometers from the Mediterranean Sea. The shells that archaeologists found there date back 75,000 years. Each shell found at Eshkul had a hole on the back, most likely made by humans. Archaeologists believe that they indicate social or martial status. But there is more to that. This finding shows that cultures and societies exist for much, much longer than expected. When we travel ahead in time and get to the year 3800 BC, we are at the time of the Babylonian Empire. They were the first to do something you're just too familiar with in Australia. The Babylonians ran a census and collected its citizens' personal information every 6 to 7 years. They did so to estimate how much food they needed to feed their population. The Egyptians ran 7 censuses 1500 years later. They leveraged the numbers about their population to determine who would get how much land after the annual flooding of the Nile. Censuses continued across various empires and civilizations: the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, all the way to where we are now. Historically, people needed only to state their name and profession, and possibly their parents' names and relatives. Nowadays, it either happens online using codes sent via paper mail, or by statisticians going from door to door collecting information and estimating the total population of a country. Moving from the EMEA region to APAC, another form of identification has been common among the Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand. In their culture, the head is considered the most important part of the body. Their facial tattoos, tā moko, represent and indicate a certain status, rank, ancestry, and abilities. It's thus unique to each individual. The tattoos are made by using sharp bone chisels to cut the design into the skin. Soot-based pigments would then be put into the open wounds. The wounds would heal over and seal in the design. While the tā moko covered most parts of Maori men's faces, Maori women usually had the tā moko only around mouth and nose. They also served a different purpose, preventing the skin to become wrinkled. In 1829, the British Parliament started to place more emphasis on printed police records. With that, data could be stored in a personal document and linked back to individuals. This is the direct predecessor to what we have these days to identify people: government-issued ID cards and passports. 29 years later, in 1858, Sir William Herschel made a biometric breakthrough. He successfully implemented ink fingerprints as manual signatures on wills and deeds, making it a means of precise identification. This practice evolved into Scotland Yard's fingerprint classification system and would later be automated by the Japanese and further improved by the Americans. All these approaches have something in common. They work offline and identify a person towards another person, from shells over tattoos to ID cards and fingerprints. When you know how to read them, you can determine information about the person wearing or carrying it. But we are at an IT conference, so people-to-people identification is less of our concern today. I mean, sure, when we're back at the face-to-face conference eventually, we should be able to identify ourselves again, which, as far as I remember, works by either stating one's name or by remembering somebody else's face and associating it with a name. It's the people-to-machine, machine-to-people, and machine-to-machine identification that we're mostly concerned about in this talk. Usernames and passwords are the core of how we identify ourselves towards computers. Coincidentally, passwords have a deep historic background as well. Back in the Roman military, while called watchwords, they allowed a tribune to find which maniple under his command was not reporting back within due time. Variations of username and password include email and password or ID number and password. When implementing password-based authentication, it's vital to ensure to never store the clear-text password. Doing so can easily be considered grossly negligent. It's also important to remember to never encrypt a password, but to hash it. The difference between encryption and hashing is vital to the security of a system. An encrypted password can be decrypted and thus converted back into its clear-text form. A hashed password, on the other hand, cannot be returned into its clear-text form. That is, when using modern cryptographic hash functions, and also ignoring quantum computing. Historically, hash functions like MD4, MD5, SHA-1 and plain SHA-2 were used to hash passwords on a server. While secure at the time of their design, they have shown their weaknesses and some are formally broken. So-called rainbow tables and simple brute forcing can be used to unhash a password. Over time, a process called password salting was developed. In addition to a user-supplied password, a random string called the salt is added. For security, the salt must be different for each password. Otherwise, it doesn't provide much benefit compared to not having a salt at all. Salting makes the use of rainbow tables pretty much infeasible. However, specialized hardware with a focus on parallel processing of the same operation can still create and compare millions of password hashes per second, leaving the brute force attack vector unmitigated. Algorithms such as bcrypt, scrypt, and argon2 have been developed to make brute forcing those password hashes significantly harder. While bcrypt tries to solve the problem by solely adding a cost factor to be increased over time, scrypt requires a huge amount of memory to work. This makes using it in highly parallelized hardware infeasible. When it comes to implementing scrypt and argon2 in Python, Python has us covered. What we have here are two snippets, one implementing the hashing using scrypt, the other one using argon2. Scrypt is part of Python's standard library and doesn't need any additional libraries, whereas argon2 depends on the argon2 CFFI library. The downside of scrypt, the way it's implemented, is the lack of encoding the hashes setup. When you look at the argon2 hash, you see various options encoded in the string, from the hash name of the time cost factor, the parallelization, and the maximum memory cost. For scrypt, you're on your own to encode and store those parameters. When you use Django, you can use the built-in argon2 password hasher or scrypt password hasher. Everything till here is pretty much standard and likely and hopefully known to most of you. But what else is out there? RFCs 2069, 2617, and 7617 define two authentication approaches called digit authentication and basic authentication. They have been standardized since 1997 and 1999 respectively. Because of this, pretty much every web server out there can technically perform those authentication methods. Nowadays, basic authentication tends to be more common, since it's easier to perform and doesn't require to store the password in clear text on the server. Basic authentication works by having the server reply with a www authenticate header to a request, instead of delivering its content. Browsers will then ask the user for a username and password. Once entered, the browser will resubmit the initial request and send the authorization header along. The content after the basic part is a base64 encoding of the username and password, joined by a colon. I leave it as an exercise to you to tell me the username and password for this request here. As you can easily realize, if a connection between a client and server is not secure, a man-in-the-middle attack can easily leak a username and password. As noted, the problem with basic authentication is the potential leaking of user passwords, since they are sent over the wire or air. Additionally, with the rise of APIs, it's not only people identifying with a machine anymore, but also machines talking to each other. Often on behalf of a specific user, but not necessarily. To solve those issues, token authentication was invented. Tokens are typically mostly random bytes encoded in hex or base64. Token authentication works similarly to basic authentication, except that the client sends the token along right away, instead of waiting for the server to ask for it. Instead of the basic keyword to identify the type of authentication, token is used. It's important to know that such tokens automatically identify and authenticate a request. While man-in-the-middle attacks are still possible, tokens usually don't grant access to the whole account, but only a subset of features. Which means that an attacker might be able to read some user data, but not write. In the case of services acting on behalf of a user, those tokens are often called personal access tokens, or PATs. In March 2021, GitHub introduced an update to their tokens, following a schema that was previously implemented by Stripe and Slack. Tokens now contain a prefix. Similarly, tokens to authenticate against PyPI, the Python package index, also contain a prefix. These prefixes don't provide any additional security, but they allow easier detection of secrets in code bases by using a feature called secret scanning. Very similar to the just explained token authentication is the bearer authentication. It stems from the OAuth authentication flow. OAuth provides a method for clients to access a protected resource on behalf of a resource owner. In the general case, before a client can access a protected resource, it must first obtain an authorization grant from the resource owner. It then exchanges the grant for an access token. The access token represents the grant's scope, duration, and other attributes. The client accesses the protected resource by presenting the access token to the resource server. In some cases, a client can directly present its own credentials to the authorization server to obtain an access token, without having to first obtain an authorization grant from the resource owner. A bearer-style authentication has a huge benefit over all previous authentication methods. The password or the secret that is used for the authentication never leaves the client. Instead, in the case at hand, the secret is used to sign a JavaScript web token. If the JWT includes a nonce or is short-lived, a man-in-the-middle attack might be able to read the token, but since it expires shortly after, or can only be used once, the attacker can often only do limited things with those tokens. A similar approach was developed by AWS to access the APIs. In AWS's HMAC-based approach, the AWS secret access key is used to sign certain header values and the AWS access key ID. Since I just mentioned JWTs, and because I know how popular they are, I want to echo numerous concerns and issues around them, graciously provided by James Bennett, a long and well-known member of Django's security team. In short, JWTs are over-complex and put too much power in an attacker's hands. There are too many knobs and variations that give an attacker too much control. JWTs can be signed or not. JWTs can be encrypted or not. The details of the signing or encryptions are encoded as part of the JWT itself. And while SSL and TLS have learned the hard way how to do, or rather not to do, cipher authentication, JWT did not learn. And when 5 libraries all make the same implementation mistake, it's rather hard to argue it's bad programming. It's more likely that the specification did a bad job of making sure people avoid a certain vulnerability. So stop using JWTs. Okay, what else can you use? Well, if you want to stick to JSON encoding, how about you use JSON dumps, pass it through base64 and in a page append an HMAC. Turns out you can do that in 6 lines of Python. Sure, you use the flexibility to choose the signing algorithm. But that's exactly the point. There's no way for an attacker to negotiate you down to a hash algorithm. That's less secure than SHA-256. If you're using Django, just use Django core signing, which implements something like this, just a bit more flexible and reliably. Okay, after this excursus and rant on JWTs, let's continue. On the note of public key cryptography, I want to mention mutual authentication. Most widely known is probably SSH using SSH keys. A client's public key is put on a target server, and during the connection process, the server sends an encrypted and signed message to the client, who verifies the server authenticity and sends an encrypted and signed message back. That message can be used by the server to authenticate the client. Less well known is MTLS or mutual TLS. While typical TLS only provides the authenticity of a server to a client, MTLS also provides the authenticity of a client to a server. However, since the process is not particularly user-friendly, it's less often seen in user applications. Given the added security, however, it's mostly used in corporate environments and situations where servers talk to each other and a so-called zero-trust network is present. While these public key cryptography approaches have a significant benefit or avoid user passwords, they still suffer from potential problem. The private key could be leaked on the client side due to malware or rootkits. 3 years ago, a new kid joined the authentication party and moved the private keys off of the hardware that is used by a user to log into a service. FIDO2 is a standard by the FIDO Alliance and was first developed and released in 2019. It defines the WebAuthn W3C specification for using public key cryptography to authenticate towards a web service. The goal is to reduce the amount of passwords used to authenticate on the web, and thus make hacking accounts significantly harder. I won't go into the details of the WebAuthn flow, but as briefly mentioned, the important part is the authenticator. This can be a device like a USB dongle or an NFC device, something that's separate from the device that the user wants to log in on. By having the keys on a dedicated hardware that they never leave, there's no way for the secret key to be leaked. Probably most notable in this field are YubiKeys. The browser asks the user to insert it and confirm that they want to perform a certain operation by touching its metal sensor. The USB key then signs a server challenge and provides it back to the browser, who sends it back to the server, who now can authenticate this user. So where does it leave us with? It leaves us with loads of ways for users and services to identify themselves and to authenticate each other. I talked about the good old password authentication, which has accompanied us ever since the internet exists. It certainly solves its purpose, but it's far from ideal. Every so often, services get hacked and user data, including their passwords, is leaked. We are lucky when the service used a strong and modern hash method and didn't store passwords in clear text. We talked about token authentication, which is ideal for service-to-service authentication and identification in a trusted network. However, if the network isn't trusted, something stronger might be required. Pre-shared keys like the AWS credentials or client ID and client secret in the OAuth process can reduce the problem of key leakage by using signatures for authentication. Similarly, public key cryptography can be used for authentication without the need to share the secret upfront. And lastly, physical hardware, such as YubiKeys or other types of hardware security modules, can move the cryptographic operations off of the normal hardware into specific hardware that keeps the secret keys safe. With that, I want to thank the organizers for the Snake Oil Academy 2021 and PyCon Australia 2021 for yet another well-organized event. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and I hope you learned something. And lastly, I want to credit some sites that provided quite some useful information, especially with regards to the historic events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Markus, and thanks for joining us at, I'm not even going to pretend I know the time. I should have asked while we were talking.
It's 9:27 in the morning now.
Oh, this is not too bad. This is all right.
No, it's not. It's not. Unless we get up in the middle of the night to watch other talks and then go back to sleep, which I probably should have not done. And watch the recordings later.
Right. We have one very important question for you. Tom would like to know if you've just told him to roll his own crypto.
Well, everybody who wants to roll their own crypto should figure out if that is really a good idea and if they make the right life choices there. Generally, no, please do not roll your own crypto, but rolling your own crypto doesn't necessarily mean that, or appending a signature to some blob of data isn't particularly rolling your own crypto, from my perspective. Rolling your own crypto is when you go and implement SHA-256 or AES yourself, like implement the underlying cryptographic algorithms. That is something that you absolutely should not do. Just don't. The moment where you go and do that, you probably do that because you started building your own programming language and can't rely on anything else. But also then it's probably something you probably don't want to do. Like, yeah, don't write your own crypto, but appending a signature based on properly implemented methods is absolutely fine.
So tread carefully then.
Yes, please.
It's fantastic to have you here again, closing up the day for us. We'll be back in a couple of minutes to give a quick wrap up to the day. So we'll see you all shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.